Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today we're going to deviate from the usual format. Last week, we wrapped up the history of Napa State Hospital, and this week, we're going to learn about a man who was a patient at Napa State Hospital. The connection between him and Napa is brief and a bit tenuous, but I still think it's worth exploring. He's one of the more notorious patients to ever reside at Napa, and I chose to discuss him because he's no longer there. There are still some well-known patients at Napa, but I wouldn't feel comfortable discussing them here. No matter what their crimes are, they still have a right to privacy under HIPAA. But before I begin, I want to issue several giant trigger warnings for this episode, and you can decide if you'd like to continue listening or come back for the next episode. The story we'll be discussing contains mention of extreme child abuse, sexual assault, kidnapping, lots of assault, a possible death by suicide, and homicide. What I will add is that because of the case that led to this man's final arrest, significant changes were made in the law in California and in other states that would keep men like this one behind bars for good. So come on in and buckle up, because this is the really terrible story of Richard Allen Davis. Richard Allen Davis was one of those people who never really stood a chance from the beginning and did the worst he could do with the hand he was dealt. He was born on June 2nd, 1954 in San Francisco, California, to Evelyn Smith and Bob Davis. He would be the third of 5 children. Both of Davis's parents were alcoholics who horrifically abused their children. When Davis was only 3 years old, his mother caught him playing with matches, and he was forced to stand still and hold his hand over an open flame until it blistered. This specific punishment was observed by others on at least 2 occasions. What's more, all the children were exposed to frequent episodes of domestic violence between their parents. Davis's parents separated when he was 9 years old, and his mother sent her children to Chowchilla to live with her mother, who was part of the Northern Paiute tribe. Their mom then abandoned them. The children stayed there until their parents' divorce was finalized when Davis was 11 years old. They were given the choice of whether they wanted to live with their father or their mother. Neither seemed to be a particularly good option, but Davis and his 2 younger sisters opted to live with their father in La Honda, a small town south of the San Francisco Bay Area. Davis's father struggled with his own mental health issues in addition to alcohol addiction. He was said to experience hallucinations that were so significant, he would take his gun outside and start shooting at people or things that no one else could see. He was unable to care for his children and was frequently absent, leaving his children in the care of other family members, babysitters, or his girlfriends. Davis's younger sister would later say that there was never a full week when their dad would be present. By the time he was 12 years old, Davis already had a criminal record. He was placed on probation at 12 for burglary and forgery of a $10 mail order. And I have to imagine that he had extreme attachment deficiencies. He never had a consistent caregiver, and the people who were supposed to care for him were not safe to be around. I don't know the circumstances of the burglary when he was 12, but it's at least possible he could have been stealing for survival. I don't say that to absolve him by any means, but I could at least appreciate the desperation if Dad weren't providing for them. Davis was the oldest of the children living with their father, so maybe he felt a sense of stepping into the provider role. I'm speculating here, of course, but it's at least possible. When he was 14, tragedy struck when his younger sister, 10-year-old Patricia, died of an illness. And I want to pause here for a moment because if you've been keeping a mental tally of the ACEs Davis has experienced thus far, you've probably lost count. If you're unfamiliar with ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, it's a set of 10 traumatic events that could potentially happen during a person's childhood. If a child experiences at least 4 of those 10 events, they're at significantly higher risk of developing physical or psychological illness when they're older, and more at risk of becoming addicted to substances or dying by suicide. So let's do a quick checklist for Richard Allen Davis to see how many ACEs he likely experienced. First is physical abuse. We know he experienced that from both his mother and his father. At some point, his father broke Davis's jaw, and on another occasion, threw him through a sheetrock wall. The second is sexual abuse. Now, this one is unknown. The sources I gathered didn't seem to point toward it, so I won't count it. Third is psychological abuse, and this factors in behaviors like gaslighting, bullying, or guilt tripping. Again, this one is possible, maybe even probable, but without specific examples, I'm not going to count it. Fourth is physical neglect, and I think it's safe to count this one since the father was rarely around. Fifth is psychological neglect, which involves a caregiver giving attention and affection. Since his mother abandoned her kids and his father wasn't around very often, it seems really safe to count this one. Sixth is witnessing domestic abuse. I mentioned earlier that Davis's parents frequently fought, and their children were present during many instances of domestic abuse. Seventh is witnessing drug or alcohol abuse. Both of his parents struggled with alcohol use, so we can count this one. Eighth is mental health problems. It sounds like Davis's father experienced some form of psychosis, so he could meet this criterion. Ninth is parental imprisonment. I didn't actually find anything about either parent being arrested or going to prison, so that's a no for this one. And last is parental separation or divorce, which we know happened. So if we estimate conservatively, only counting the criteria we know he experienced, Richard Allen Davis met 7 of the 10 ACEs criteria. That's really high. And it doesn't even factor in the death of his sister. Remember that any score above 4 correlates with poorer health outcomes later in life. Now, I want to make sure that I emphasize that having multiple ACEs does not inherently make someone more violent or more likely to engage in crime. The original ACEs study actually showed that people with a certain number of ACEs were more likely to have certain types of health problems, like cardiovascular issues, obesity, substance abuse, etc. In Davis's case, however, his tumultuous upbringing likely impacted his later criminal behavior. By the time he was 15 years old, he was on probation for burglary. He would later tell a psychiatrist that stealing relieved whatever tensions were building up inside him. And clearly, his behaviors were affecting his daily life because he dropped out of high school his sophomore year. An SF Gate article says that in November 1969, when Davis was 15, his father turned both him and his older brother over to juvenile authorities for, quote, incorrigibility. This would be the first of several occasions this happened. When he was 17 years old, Davis was caught for stealing a motorcycle. The judge gave him the choice of going to the California Youth Authority or joining the U.S. Army. He chose the Army. And I have mixed feelings about this because for some young people who get into trouble, the structure of military life can be really beneficial. Having consistency and people to depend on can be life-changing. For someone like Davis, with budding psychopathic tendencies, I don't know the military life would be very helpful. And clearly he struggled. His military record reflects several infractions for AWOL, fighting, failure to report, and morphine use. Regardless, he ended up serving for 13 months before receiving a general discharge in August 1972. After getting out of the military, Davis clearly struggled with alcohol abuse. In 1973 alone, he was arrested 4 times for alcohol-related offenses. But Perhaps most notably, when Davis was 19, he attended a party on October 12th, 1973, at the home of 18-year-old Marlene Voris. By the end of the night, Marlene was found dead from a gunshot. Strangely, there were 7 suicide notes found at the scene, so her death was ruled a suicide. Marlene's friends, though, strongly believed that it was Davis who had killed her, but he would never be charged with her death. Just 2 weeks after Voris's death, Davis was arrested for attempting to pawn property he had stolen. He was implicated in more than 20 burglaries around La Honda and served 6 months in county jail. Only 5 weeks after he was released, in May 1974, he was arrested for yet another burglary, this time at South San Francisco High School. He was sent to CMF Vacaville for a 90-day diagnostic study. A county probation officer recommended that he be sent to prison, but before he could be sentenced, Davis enrolled in a VA-sponsored alcohol treatment program. But he dropped out the next day. He would later be sentenced to 1 year in county jail for the school burglary, but was allowed to leave to attend yet another drug and alcohol treatment program. Unsurprisingly, he absconded from that program too. Now, when he left jail, Davis left behind 2 inmates who had given him money to buy drugs and bring back with him. When he failed to return, they were not too pleased. So when those inmates were later released, they tracked down Davis and shot him in the back. He would later testify against those inmates and be known as a snitch. Once he was sent back to jail, he had to be placed into protective custody. By 1975, and mind you, Davis is only 21 years old at this point, he's again arrested a couple of times. First for auto theft and possession of marijuana, and he served only 10 days in jail. Next for burglary in San Francisco and grand theft. Here, he was given the baffling sentence of 6 months to 15 years in prison, and he ended up serving a year in CMF Vacaville before being released. I hope you're seeing a pattern here. This is someone who clearly cannot stop committing crimes. He can't even go a few weeks before getting rearrested. Now, granted, most of his offenses to this point are nonviolent. Burglary, by definition, is not inherently violent. You break in, you steal something, you get out. It feels very violating, but not necessarily violent. Robbery, on the other hand, is where a person steals something from a person, usually through the use of a threat. So something like, "Give me all your money or I'll cut you." So even though most of his arrests are for nonviolent offenses, they're clearly escalating and he's getting more brazen. There's also that big question mark of whether or not he actually killed Marlene Voris. But this would be the end of his nonviolent offenses. And just a reminder of the trigger warnings from the beginning, because things are about to get really ugly. Davis was paroled from CMF Vacaville on August 2nd, 1976. 7 weeks later, on September 24th, 1976, he approached 26-year-old Frances Mays at the BART, or Bay Area Rapid Transit parking lot, when she was on her way home from work. He held a knife to her and said, "There's somebody following me. I need to get away from here. I will not hurt you." He forced Mays into her car and held her at knife point. When she tried to unlock the door, he hit her. Davis then pulled into a remote parking lot and said, "I lied. There's nobody following me." And Mays, understandably terrified, began crying, and he hit her again. And that's when he exposed himself and held his knife to her, ordering her to perform oral sex. But this badass noticed a car approaching, grabbed his knife by the blade, which seemed to shock him just enough that she was able to open the door, and ran toward the road. And the passing car just happened to be a California Highway Patrol officer on his way to work. He captured Davis and awaited responding officers while his wife comforted Frances Mays. Davis later pled guilty to kidnapping and assault with a deadly weapon, and the sexual assault charges were dropped in return. This all happened at the end of September 1976. Sometime around the beginning of December of that year, Davis attempted to hang himself at the Alameda County Jail. The attempt was interrupted, and he was sent to Napa State Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. See, I told you we'd get to the connection with Napa. Unfortunately, the whole transfer to Napa was either a setup, a plan by Davis, or he saw an opportunity and seized it. 8 days after his admission, on December 16th, 1976, Davis escaped from the hospital. Somehow he had accidentally been admitted as a voluntary patient instead of a dangerous inmate needing psychiatric services. He would later say that he had faked the suicide attempt in order to be transferred to Napa. Davis then went on a 4-day crime spree around Napa. He first broke into the home of Marjorie Mitchell, a nurse from the state hospital. She later recalled being awakened in the early morning to find a man standing over her. She said she felt a pain in her head that had woken her up. It turned out to be Davis who had struck her repeatedly with a fireplace poker, and her wounds required 30 stitches. He then broke into the Napa County Animal Shelter and stole a shotgun, which he later used to try to kidnap 60-year-old Hazel Frost. Frost, a bartender in Napa, was getting into her car outside a restaurant when Davis jumped in on the other side and held the shotgun to her neck. He ordered her to drive to the dark side of the restaurant as he was pulling what looked like tape out of his pocket. And again, this woman, it sounds like something from an action film, decided it was either be killed or bail. So she bailed, rolling out of her car, grabbing the pistol loaded with birdshot from underneath her seat, and fired 4 or 5 shots at Davis, who had fled by this point, but missed. And Davis hightailed it out of Napa and went back to La Honda, where he broke into the home of Josephine Krieger. Fortunately, he was seen by a sheriff's deputy and arrested right away. Mind you, this whole spree, hitting Marjorie Mitchell with a fire poker, stealing a shotgun from the animal shelter, attempting to abduct Hazel Frost, and breaking into Josephine Krieger's house, all took place within 4 days. He escaped from Napa State Hospital on December 16th and was arrested in San Mateo County on December 21st. And he's 22 at this point. You would think that after the kidnapping and assault of Frances Mays, the escape from Napa, the 4-day violent crime spree, that this guy would be put away for a long time, right? Unfortunately, no. This is where the justice system failed the community. Davis was sentenced to a term of 1 to 25 years in prison for Mays kidnapping, and he was sentenced to concurrent terms for the Napa crime spree. If they had only erred on the longer side of the sentence, if they had only given him consecutive terms for the Napa crime spree, then maybe he would have had other victims. But Davis ended up serving fewer than 5 years in prison for his offenses. He was released in March 1982 to a vocational institute in Tracy, California. He was 28 years old at this point. But, of course, Davis couldn't stay out of trouble for long. He soon met Sue Edwards, described by Denise No as, quote, a plump, bottle-blonde motorcycle mama in her early 20s who earned her living as a drug dealer, end quote. And together, Davis and Edwards became lovers and partners in crime. They dealt drugs, robbed stores and restaurants, and terrorized law enforcement in California, Oregon, and Washington. On November 30th, 1984, Davis and Edwards went to the home of Selena Verich. Selena had been in a relationship with Edwards' sister years before, so they were familiar with her. They began yelling at and threatening Selena before she even opened the door. You're going to listen to us now, because if you don't, we're going to kill your daughter, your father, and yourself, all 3 of you. Selena reluctantly let them in, and Edwards immediately went over and tore the phone off the wall while Davis pointed a gun at Selena. In her panic, she attempted to escape, but before she could get to the door, both Davis and Edwards tackled her. Davis struck her hard in the face with his pistol, calling her to splatter blood. "You better stop screaming or we'll kill you." Davis and Edwards then forced Selena to take them to her bank, withdraw $6,000, and hand it over to them. Even though she must have had fresh wounds to her face, Selena was able to withdraw the money without raising suspicion from the bank teller. She handed it over to Davis and Edwards, who immediately took off. The pair found themselves driving up the West Coast until they ended up in Kennewick, Washington. There, they robbed a bank of $4,000, a Value Giant store, and a Red Steer restaurant. Then they headed back to California. In March 1985, Davis and Edwards were arrested in Modesto, California, when a police officer noticed a defective taillight. The couple was then charged with robbing a yogurt shop and a bank in Modesto. The couple turned on one another, surprise, surprise, and were subsequently sent to prison. Now, you would think that someone may have looked at Davis's long rap sheet, which by now was punctuated with violent offenses and very little time in the community before reoffending, and said, "Hey, maybe this guy's pretty dangerous. Maybe he's not safe to be in the community anymore." Fortunately, I guess, Davis was sentenced to 16 years in prison for the kidnapping and robbery of Selena Verich and sent to California Men's Colony Prison in San Luis Obispo. There he was trained in sheet metal working and turned out to be pretty darn good at it. His supervisor said he was the best worker they'd ever had. Lots of potential. But I guess some people just prefer crime. Now, I have to mention the drama that went on between Richard Allen Davis and his best girl, Sue Edwards. As it turned out, prison couldn't separate the two lovebirds. Edwards had only served 6 months for her role in the crimes. When she got out, she married a man who was found murdered less than 3 months after their marriage. The culprit? Edwards' new boyfriend, Floyd Bailey. So Edwards took the $300,000 she'd inherited from her husband, bought a Corvette, drove down to see Davis at CMC. And I'm sorry, this gal had a husband, a boyfriend, and a prison lover? Now that's just not fair. You have to share with the rest of us. But the visits to Davis continued, and soon the two were engaged. Aww. Until Edwards called it off, that is. But it's probably something about her fiancé being locked up for 16 years. I don't know, just a guess. But Davis was heartbroken and enraged. Meanwhile, Edwards was being investigated for her possible role in her husband's death. During that investigation, detectives learned that she had never legally divorced her first husband, William Edwards. Prosecutors were preparing to charge her with bigamy when they received an offer of help from who else than Richard Allen Davis. He volunteered to testify against his former fiancée, and Sue Edwards was then convicted of bigamy and sentenced to 6 years in prison. Davis, meanwhile, only ended up serving half of his 16-year sentence and was paroled on June 27, 1993. For a while, he seemed to be doing okay. He moved into a homeless shelter in San Mateo. He met his appointments with his parole officer. He passed his drug tests. He even found a job doing sheet metal work and was pretty good at it. Pretty soon, he had enough money to buy himself a white Ford Pinto. But this is Richard Allen Davis we're talking about. He wouldn't be able to keep up the legally abiding ruse for long. And the worst was still yet to come. Davis later claimed that he went to Petaluma, California, looking for his mother, who is living up there. Petaluma is north of the Bay Area, about 65 miles from San Mateo, where Davis had been living. He said he couldn't find his mother, but he did find some guys selling marijuana. He smoked a joint that he later claimed was laced with PCP, even though his drug test the next day was clean. We'll learn that much of what this guy said throughout this case was a lie. Whatever the reason, on the night of October 1st, 1993, Davis found himself in central Petaluma near Wickersham Park. Across the street, 12-year-old Polly Class was having a sleepover with her friends, Kate and Jillian. It was almost Halloween, so the girls were trying out different spooky makeup looks. Polly's mother, Eve, poked her head into the room and asked the girls to keep it down because she had a migraine and she was going to sleep. Eve put Polly's younger sister, Annie, to bed, took some prescription sleep medicine, and went to sleep. Around 10:30 p.m., the girls were playing a board game called Perfect Match, probably giggling and having fun like 6th grade or 7th grade girls tend to do. Polly went to get their sleeping bags from another room. She opened the door and was probably stunned to find a man she didn't know standing in the doorway. He was tall and had bushy hair and a beard and held a duffel bag in one hand. For a second, the girls must have thought it must have been a joke. Polly liked to play jokes. Then they saw the knife in his other hand. "Who lives here?" he asked the girls. It wasn't a joke. Polly must have been so scared. "I live here," she said. "I mean no harm," he said. "I'm only here for money." He pushed his way into the room, saying, "Don't say anything or I'll cut your throats." He then tied up Kate and Jillian, gagged them, and put pillowcases over both of their heads. He grabbed Polly to have her show him where the valuables were. "Now count to 1,000, he said to Kate and Jillian, and Polly would be back by the time they were finished. The girls struggled with their hands tied behind their backs, and after about 20 minutes ended up freeing themselves from their restraints. Jillian ran to wake up Polly's mother, Eve, while Kate ran around the house calling for Polly. Like the girls, Eve thought it was a terrible joke at first. She must have also been a bit sluggish from the start of sleep and the medicine she'd just taken. But when she heard Kate calling for Polly, she knew something was wrong. Polly was gone. An hour later, about 20 miles away, a woman named Dana had arrived home and was sending her babysitter home for the night. The driveway to Dana's home was very long and rural. When the babysitter was driving down the driveway, she passed a man whose car was stuck in the ditch. Strange that he would be out this far. Certainly he should know that he was on private property. She rolled down her window just an inch to talk to him, and although he asked her for help, something seemed off. His eyes were too wide and crazy. She quickly drove off and got to a place where she could use a phone. She called Dana, who grabbed a baseball bat and went down her driveway to confront the trespasser. When she got to the spot, she only saw the car. The man was nowhere to be seen. So Dana called the police, who arrived at the scene a little after midnight. When police arrived, the man was back at the car and he seemed agitated. There were leaves and debris in his hair, which he said was from crawling under his car trying to get it out. He was also sweaty, which was notable because the weather that night was cool. Again, something seemed off. Police asked him what he was doing there, and he said he had been out sightseeing. Sightseeing? On a rural country road? At midnight? Sure. He smelled like alcohol, so they gave him a roadside sobriety test, and he passed. So they ran his information, his license plate, and nothing notable came up. The problem was they had incorrectly entered the numbers by one digit. Had they correctly entered the number, had the APB for a kidnapped young girl gone out to all officers in the area that night, maybe they could have stopped him right then. But they didn't. Officers told Dana, the homeowner, that she'd have to make a citizen's arrest in order for them to arrest him. Otherwise, they didn't really have a reason to detain him. She declined, so police helped pull the white Pinto out of the ditch, and the man was released. Of course, that man was Richard Allen Davis. While the community and the nation searched for Polly, Davis was caught drunk driving and arrested only 18 days after her kidnapping. He failed to appear in court for that charge. Almost 2 months after Polly's kidnapping, on November 28, 1993, Dana, the homeowner who had confronted the strange man in her driveway, was inspecting part of her property that had recently been logged. She came across some strange items. Child-size red tights tied together at the knees, a sweatshirt, a silky piece of fabric made into a hood, and some other debris. Dana remembered the strange man from 2 months prior and realized that these items could have something to do with the kidnapping from October. She immediately called the police. 2 days later, on November 30th, Davis was arrested for parole violation on the Coyote Valley Indian Reservation, about 85 miles north of Petaluma. They took his fingerprints and a palm print, which matched a palm print left at the scene of Polly's kidnapping. He quickly became their prime suspect. So police interrogated Davis for hours, and he rambled off a litany of lies. Even today, there are multiple stories about what happened to Polly. Did he or did he not sexually assault her? Was she or was she not still alive when the police interrogated Davis in Dana's driveway? We'll probably never know the truth. What we do know is that Davis strangled Polly to death on the night of October 1st. He had planned to leave her in the area around Dana's driveway, but after being caught, had to go back and move her body. On December 4th, 1993, Davis led investigators to a place off Highway 101 near Cloverdale, 50 miles north of Petaluma, where Polly's body was finally located. He had thrown a piece of plywood over her body. I'll spare you the details of how she was found, but suffice it to say that it was badly decomposed at that time. 2 years later, Davis stood trial for the murder and kidnapping of 12-year-old Polly Klaas. The trial lasted 2 months, from April 17th to June 18th, 1996, and his behavior during the trial was abhorrent. In front of her parents, Davis referred to Polly as that broad, which understandably enraged her father. Can you imagine the man who murdered your 12-year-old daughter calling her a broad? Like, it's gross. Even worse, after Davis was found guilty for the offense, he said in a statement that Polly's final words were, "Just don't do me like my dad did." Ugh. And in the audio, there's a gasp from Polly's grandmother before Polly's father, Mark Klaas, is heard swearing at Davis and lunging toward him. He had to be restrained by the bailiff and removed from the courtroom. By the way, there was never any proof that Polly's father had harmed or violated her in any way. By all accounts, they had a close relationship and he was a good father. In August 1996, Richard Allen Davis was read his sentence, death by lethal injection. In response, he flipped off the TV cameras with both hands, winked, and blew a kiss. Absolutely despicable behavior. Davis was then sent to San Quentin State Prison. He's doubly stigmatized and remains in protective custody, not only because he killed a child, but because of his role in the passage of the three strikes law, which I'll discuss in a moment. I can't imagine that other inmates would be too happy about that. He's said to have been in a couple of fights with other inmates and, in 2006, overdosed on opiates, although he was discovered and revived. He remains on death row at San Quentin, and he's 69 years old. And that's all I want to say about his life and crimes. Now I want to briefly address the long-lasting impact that Davis has had on the criminal justice system around the U.S. After Davis was arrested in 1993, there was public outcry about how this career criminal, who had been in and out of jail and prison for his entire life, could have been free in the first place to offend and kill Polly. Surely there had to be tougher punishments for repeat offenders like Davis, right? And lawmakers agreed. Inspired in part by the Polly Klaas case, on March 7th, 1994, the 3 strikes and you're out law went into effect in California. This meant that anyone convicted of 3 or more felonies would be put away for life. No shortened sentences, no second chances. California would now be tough on crime. Today, 28 states in the U.S. have 3 strikes laws. The problem was, and maybe you've recognized this theme by now, was that this was yet another law with good intentions that was not great in practice. Yes, it had its strengths, notably that people like Richard Allen Davis, who had committed multiple violent offenses, should be and were being locked up for life. But it also meant that people with non-violent felonies, including people with severe mental illness and a disproportionate number of people of color, were being locked away for good. And I can't even tell you how many of my patients are rightfully concerned because they're already on their second strike for offenses that many, quote, law-abiding citizens have been guilty of. Things like fighting in a bar after they've had one too many drinks, or stealing a piece of pizza off a stranger's plate. That's a real example, just not one of my patients. Again, it's not to excuse those crimes, but just to put it in perspective. Other times, their psychiatric symptoms have caused the behavior. They're paranoid about law enforcement, so when they're stopped for loitering around a store, they think the police are out to get them, and they fight for their lives. And that turns into assault against a police officer and resisting arrest. Strike. And so, because of the problems noticed early on with the law, the three strikes law was later amended so that only serious or violent felonies would be considered strikes. Crimes like robbery, kidnapping, murder, most sex offenses, any offense in which a weapon was used, any offense in which great bodily injury was inflicted, arson, crimes involving explosive devices, or attempts to commit any of those offenses. And people serving sentences for their first or second strike would have to serve at least 80% of their sentence. It's still imperfect, but it's a somewhat improved system. Even Polly Klaas's sisters have mixed feelings about the law. In the 30 years since their sister's death, they've become vocal opponents of the three strikes law, saying it was reactionary following Polly's murder. In 2021, they launched a podcast called A New Legacy, which focuses on finding alternatives to mass incarceration and tough-on-crime initiatives. A People magazine article notes, quote, "Rather than incarcerating people after the fact, we are looking for ways to prevent crime by seeking out restorative and community-based solutions that address violence at the source. In speaking with community leaders who have been forging this path forward, we will explore scientifically proven alternatives to incarceration. These strategies include rehabilitation and reentry services, community-based violence intervention, restorative justice, trauma treatment, substance abuse support, and combating economic inequality," end quote. And I appreciate this perspective. The more I work with offenders, the more I learn that crime is complex. There will always be the Richard Allen Davises of the world, the people who are truly dangerous and need to be locked up indefinitely. And there are people like many of my patients who grew up in poverty and never really learned how to live successfully in the community. People with traumatic backgrounds who turn to drugs and alcohol to numb their pain and who keep getting incarcerated because of their addiction. People who are alone in the world and don't have the support they need to make it in the community after they get out. These are the people who fall through the cracks again and again. But like Polly Klaas's sisters mentioned, as a society, we need to be more proactive about crime rather than reactive. The tough on crime mindset isn't helpful when services weren't there when the person needed them before the crime. I want to end this story on a positive note because it is such a tragic case. Only 3 weeks following Polly's kidnapping in 1993, the Polly Klaas Foundation was formed to help search for her. It has expanded over the past 30 years to include helping families locate and recover missing children, helping parents learn how to prevent child abduction, and keeping children safe in their communities. The website says that it has helped more than 10,000 families find missing children. And what's more, since Polly enjoyed music and dance and theater, the foundation has started the Polly Klaas Community Theater in Petaluma, which offers a site for performing artists, poetry and book readings, civic engagement, lectures, and educational presentations. It's such a lovely way to honor her memory. And that's where I will end the story of Richard Allen Davis, one of Napa State Hospital's most notorious patients, even though he was only there for 8 days. Thank you for sticking around during this tough episode. We'll be back next week with a new hospital in a new country we haven't discussed yet, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, thank you so much for listening. Thank you this week to Adif, ADIF09, for your review on Apple Podcasts. It is so appreciated. Thanks to everyone who joined the Facebook group page this week. If you do request to join the group, please be sure that you're answering the questions. Otherwise, I will assume that you're a bot. There have been many bots. And feel free to check out the Patreon and Beacons pages for other ways to support the show. But please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening, but especially if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. And remember, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.